In 1624, Manhattan still does not look like the capital of anything. The island is narrow, green, damp, surrounded by cold waters, with jagged shorelines, shallow coves, dense trees, low hills, exposed rocks, streams, marshes and trails opened long before the arrival of Europeans by the Lenape peoples. Before the straight streets, before the yellow taxis, before the glass towers and glowing signs, what exists there is a landscape of forest, wetlands, uneven ground, and indigenous paths that follow the logic of the land, not the logic of maps. To the south, near the tip of the island, Dutch vessels begin transforming that piece of the world into a trading post. It is not a grand city. It is a fragile point of wood, mud, smoke, and exchange, where furs, tools, barrels, weapons, fabrics, and food move between different languages, different interests, and worlds that still do not know how violently they will collide. Around 1626, the Dutch presence becomes stronger in the lower part of the island. New Amsterdam is born as a trading settlement, not as an urban dream. The place matters because it sits where the waters meet. The Hudson River opens a route into the interior. The East River connects the island to other passages. The harbor offers shelter for ships. Manhattan grows first, not because of beauty, but because of position. Whoever controls that tip controls movement, trade, and access. The first houses are simple, made of wood, with slanted roofs, irregular streets, fences, loose animals, small warehouses, and a fort trying to protect a colony that still feels improvised. Daily life is hard, damp, and unstable. There are Dutch colonists, merchants, artisans, sailors, enslaved people brought there by force, native peoples pressured by expansion, and men who see the island as opportunity, not as sacred homeland. In the 1630s and 1640s, the village begins taking shape around Fort Amsterdam, where today Lower Manhattan seems taken over by financial buildings, traffic, and crowds. But in that beginning, the landscape is still open. You can imagine smoke rising from low chimneys, the smell of wet wood, the sound of boots in the mud, the creaking of masts in the harbor, and small boats docking at rough wooden piers. The street that would later become Wall Street still has another function. In the 1650s, a wooden palisade helps mark a defensive border north of the settlement. The town protects itself from outside threats, but it also begins drawing an invisible line between colonial space and the territory being taken. In 1664, the English take control of New Amsterdam and rename it New York. The change of flag does not erase the island, but it changes its destiny. The city remains small, yet more connected to the British Atlantic world. The port gains importance. The docks multiply. Trade grows. Ships arrive with goods, news, immigrants, and also enslaved people. Manhattan becomes a place of opportunity and exploitation at the same time. In the narrow streets of the Lower Island, wealthy merchants, indebted sailors, free workers, enslaved people, children running between barrels, women carrying water, vendors, soldiers, and religious figures all move through the same cramped world. The island begins to accumulate wealth, but that wealth is not born clean. It passes through maritime trade, seized land, forced labor, and the ambition to turn the edge of a forest into a center of power. Around 1700, Manhattan could still almost fit entirely inside the imagination of someone walking through the southern part of the island. The city does not occupy everything. To the north, there are still farms, fields, rural roads, scattered properties, and landscapes that look nothing like the vertical metropolis it would become. Broadway, before becoming a symbol of theater and electric lights, partly follows the old path of an indigenous and colonial route that crossed the island irregularly. This is one of Manhattan's great hidden marks. Even when the city tries to present itself as completely planned, some of its oldest lines remain tied to the original ground. Beneath the asphalt, there are paths that came before the skyscrapers. In 1776, during the War of Independence, Manhattan stops being just a commercial port and becomes military territory. Troops, fires, British occupation, and fear alter the life of the city. The Great Fire of 1776 destroys part of New York, spreading ruins and smoke over streets that were still small compared to what the island would become. The city spends years under British control, and the war leaves physical and psychological marks. When the independent United States begins to organize itself, New York briefly emerges as the national capital. In 1789, George Washington takes office as the first president of the United States on Wall Street. That street, born near a colonial boundary, begins to symbolize another kind of power. The island that had once been a trading post now stages the political foundation of a new nation. In the 1800s, Manhattan begins to change scale. The port expands, the population grows, and the city can no longer depend only on the streets inherited from the colonial period. In 1811, the commissioner's plan draws a rigid grid to occupy most of the island. The decision seems simple on a map: numbered streets, parallel avenues, regular blocks. But on the real terrain, it means cutting through hills, filling low areas, erasing old paths, opening streets across properties, leveling the landscape, and imposing an artificial geometry over an irregular island. Manhattan begins to be imagined before it is built. The future is drawn in straight lines, even where there are still rocks, trees, rural houses, and empty lots. From the 1820s onward, the opening of the Erie Canal transforms New York into a gigantic gateway to the American interior. Goods from the Great Lakes and the West begin finding their outlet through the city's port. Manhattan becomes a funnel of wealth. Grain, timber, furs, industrial products, immigrants, and money move at increasing speed. What had once been a settlement by the water begins competing with other cities for the role of the country's commercial center. The docks grow busier. Warehouses rise near the port. Workers carry sacks, crates, and barrels. Streets near the water fill with taverns, boarding houses, workshops, storage buildings, and cramped homes. The city grows because the entire continent begins passing through it. In the 1840s and 1850s, Manhattan becomes an island of arrival. Irish, German, and other immigrants land in huge numbers, many fleeing hunger, poverty, conflict, and the lack of a future. For those who arrive, the island can feel like promise and threat at the same time. There is work, but there is misery. There is movement, but there is overcrowding. Neighborhoods like Five Points become symbols of urban poverty, violence, cultural mixture, and survival. The streets are narrow, the tenements crowded, the alleys damp, the families large, the smells intense. Manhattan begins to show its deepest contradiction. The richer it becomes, the more it exposes the inequality of those who sustain that wealth from below. In 1857, the creation of Central Park reveals another kind of transformation. In the middle of an island becoming increasingly occupied, the idea emerges to preserve a large planned green space. But that park is not born over an empty void. Communities, small properties, churches, cemeteries, and residents existed there, including Seneca Village, a community with an important presence of free African Americans. To build the park, people were removed, and a landscape was redesigned to look natural. Central Park would become one of the most famous places in the world, but its beauty carries a less visible memory. That of a city that learned to create public landscapes, also by erasing private lives. In 1863, during the Civil War, Manhattan erupts in tension with the draft riots. The streets become a stage for revolt, racism, fear, poverty, and political violence. The island was already a financial and commercial center, but it was also a city of poor workers, newly arrived immigrants, and vulnerable communities. The distant war appears in the stones of the streets. The conflict shows that Manhattan was not only a showcase of progress, it was a city pressured by inequality, labor disputes, prejudice, and economic interests tied to the entire country. Between 1870 and 1900, the island grows upward, outward, and inward. Railroads, ferries, streetcars, and later elevated lines begin to accelerate movement. Northern Manhattan urbanizes. Grand mansions appear in wealthy areas, while tenements remain crowded on the Lower East Side. Thousands of Jews from Eastern Europe, Italians, Chinese immigrants, and other groups arrive with their languages, foods, beliefs, and trades. The sidewalks fill with vendors, children, carts, laundry hanging overhead, commercial signs, and the sounds of many worlds compressed into the same space. Manhattan stops being merely an American city. It becomes a kind of arrival machine, where the world disembarks, works, suffers, mixes, and tries to climb a few steps higher. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge changes the island's relationship with its surroundings. The structure crosses the East River as a statement of engineering and ambition. Before it, crossing depended on ferries. After it, Manhattan becomes more solidly connected to Brooklyn. The bridge is not only a monumental work, it is a sign that the island can no longer contain its own energy by itself. The city begins to spread toward other boroughs, other shores, other lives. Seen from a distance, the bridge seems to unite territories. Seen up close, it shows workers, cables, stones, towers, and a city willing to challenge the river in order to keep growing. In 1898, the consolidation of Greater New York unites Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island into a larger city. Manhattan becomes the symbolic heart of an immense urban organism. In the early 1900s, the subway expands that transformation. Starting in 1904, with the first underground lines, the island gains an invisible circulation beneath the streets. Workers can live farther away and still reach the center. Distant neighborhoods move closer. The underground becomes part of daily life. While carriages, streetcars, and automobiles compete for space above, crowds begin moving below the ground, as if Manhattan had created its own veins to sustain its growth. Between 1900 and 1930, the island begins to rise aggressively. Skyscrapers transform the skyline. The Flatiron Building in 1902 reveals a new vertical elegance. The Woolworth Building in 1913 looks like a cathedral of commerce. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building push that race to the extreme. Manhattan becomes an image of modernity. Workers operate at frightening heights. Steel beams cross the sky, cranes dominate avenues, and the city learns to sell its own silhouette as a symbol of the future. But beneath the towers, life remains concrete. People taking the subway, shoeshine boys, secretaries, newsboys, immigrants, cooks, doormen, seamstresses, dock workers, and families living in small apartments. The 1920s also transformed Times Square, Broadway, and Midtown into territories of light, spectacle, and consumption. Electric signs, theaters, hotels, restaurants, newspapers, and nighttime crowds create another Manhattan, brighter, louder, more shaped by desire. At the same time, Harlem experiences a cultural explosion. During the Harlem Renaissance, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, black writers, musicians, artists, and intellectuals turned the neighborhood into a center of creation and affirmation. Manhattan is not one thing. It is Wall Street and Harlem, port and theater, tenement and penthouse, church and nightclub, stock exchange and cramped kitchen. In 1929, the stock market crash hits Wall Street and spreads its impact far beyond the island. Manhattan, which symbolized financial ambition, now also symbolizes collapse. During the 1930s, the Great Depression changes the rhythm of the streets. There is unemployment, bread lines, public works, and newly built towers trying to occupy a future that seems to have failed. Even so, the city continues to raise structures. Rockefeller Center is born during this period as a monumental attempt to maintain confidence, work, and the image of progress. Manhattan learns to turn crisis into architecture. After 1945, the island enters another phase. The post-war period strengthens offices, media, advertising, finance, universities, museums, and corporate headquarters. The United Nations headquarters, inaugurated in 1952, places Manhattan in a global symbolic position. The island begins to concentrate not only American money, but world diplomacy, mass culture, and media power. At the same time, aggressive urban projects change entire neighborhoods. Expressways, urban renewal, housing complexes, and demolitions redraw parts of the city. In many places across the United States, the post-war period pushes people toward the suburbs. Manhattan feels this movement, but it does not disappear. It adapts, loses residents in some moments, gains offices, concentrates wealth, and leaves wounds in communities removed or pressured. In the 1960s and 1970s, the image of the island changes again. There is fiscal crisis, deteriorated buildings, rising crime, abandonment in certain areas, racial tensions, protests, blackouts, and urban fear. Times Square, which had once shone as a glamorous showcase, becomes associated with decay. The Lower East Side and parts of downtown show signs of abandonment. Factories close. Warehouses lose their function. The traditional port declines with containerization and with the movement of operations to other areas. Manhattan seems, for a few years, like a tired capital, too powerful to die but wounded enough to reveal its cracks. But the same city that loses old functions begins to invent new ones. In the 1970s and 1980s, industrial neighborhoods like Soho and Tribeca begin attracting artists, galleries, and residents who occupy old lofts. What had once been space for heavy work becomes territory of creation, then of rising value, then of real estate dispute. This transformation spreads as a deep mark of Manhattan. Places once seen as decayed become desired. Industrial buildings become expensive apartments. Freight streets become consumer streets. Working-class memory begins to coexist with restored facades, cafes, shops, and prices that are unreachable for many former residents. In the 1980s and 1990s, Wall Street strengthens again, Midtown consolidates itself as a corporate center, and the city begins recovering an image of safety, tourism, and spectacle. Times Square is redeveloped, cleaned up, and transformed into a global showcase of brands, screens, and consumption. For some, this represents rebirth. For others, it means the loss of a rougher, more dangerous, more popular, and more unpredictable Manhattan. The island becomes increasingly expensive, increasingly contested, and increasingly difficult for people who live from ordinary work. What attracts the world also pushes out part of the very population that helped build its energy. In 2001, the attacks of September 11th tear through Lower Manhattan in a profound way. The Twin Towers, which had altered the island's financial skyline since the 1970s, disappear in a trauma seen by the entire world. The physical territory becomes absence, dust, twisted metal, sirens, grief, and memory. In the following years, the site becomes a memorial, a reconstruction, and a symbolic dispute over pain, security, identity, and the future. One World Trade Center comes to mark the landscape as an attempt at response, but the absence remains part of the place. Manhattan carries its losses not only in museums, but in the empty space that forces the eye to remember. From the 2000s onward, gentrification accelerates in many neighborhoods. Harlem, the Lower East Side, Chelsea, Hell's Kitchen, the East Village, and other areas go through intense changes. Old facades are restored, new buildings rise, rents increase, restaurants replace local shops, and the city seems both preserved and transformed. The High Line, opened from 2009 onward on an old elevated railway line, summarizes this turn. An abandoned industrial rail line becomes a suspended park, a tourist attraction, and a real estate engine. It is one of the strongest images of contemporary Manhattan, a reused ruin, beautiful and sophisticated, but surrounded by the question of who gets to remain when memory becomes a product. In 2020, the pandemic empties Manhattan in a way that once seemed almost impossible. Streets that appeared incapable of silence become strangely quiet. Offices close, theaters turn off their lights, restaurants struggle to survive, the subway loses riders, and the island that always depended on crowds feels the weight of absence. Then, little by little, life returns, but not exactly as before. Remote work changes the relationship with offices. Tourism returns, but with new tensions. Housing becomes even more expensive. Inequality appears in every contrast between luxury towers, shelters, delivery workers, essential workers, and empty apartments used as investments. In 2026, Manhattan remains one of the most recognizable islands on the planet. But its real history cannot fit only inside the image of skyscrapers. It still holds traces of the Lenape territory, even if almost erased. It holds the irregular line of Broadway cutting through the grid like a memory of earlier paths. It holds Dutch memory in names, streets, and underground layers. It holds Wall Street as a financial symbol, but also as the trace of an old defensive edge. It holds Central Park as a public landscape and as a reminder of forgotten removals. It holds bridges, stations, transformed tenements, old churches surrounded by towers, warehouses converted into lofts, subway lines worn down by daily use, and facades that survived because the city, despite always changing, can never erase everything. To look at Manhattan only as the capital of money, media, or skyscrapers is to see only its brightest layer. Beneath it, there is an island of forest, mud, and trails. There is a wooden colonial village. There is a port of barrels, ropes, and hard labor. There is a city of crowded immigrants. There is a landscape of bridges, steel, smoke, demolitions, protests, blackouts, reconstructions, and disputed memories. Manhattan became a kind of vertical archive where every floor seems to try to rise above the ground, but the ground keeps speaking. And perhaps that is what makes this island so powerful. It did not become the capital of the world because it was born grand. It became that way because it was rebuilt, seized, sold, contested, razed, destroyed, and reinvented so many times that it came to concentrate in just a few miles of stone and concrete, an enormous part of American history.